Picture this. The rain-soaked streets of Detroit's Corktown district glisten under the amber glow of streetlights, each droplet catching the light like scattered diamonds on asphalt. The storm that has been brewing all evening finally unleashes its fury, turning the upscale neighborhood into a watercolor painting of blurred lights and shadowed doorways. And cutting through this urban tapestry is a sleek black sedan, its windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the relentless downpour. Behind the wheel sits Dr. Vanessa Washington, a woman whose calm exterior masks the weight of secrets that could topple governments and the scars of missions that never made headlines. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather seats still carry the faint scent of foreign airports and hotel rooms, reminders of the classified operation she just completed in Eastern Europe. 3 months of deep cover work, navigating the treacherous world of international arms dealers and corrupt officials, all while maintaining the facade of a cultural attaché. Her hands, steady on the steering wheel, are the same hands that had disarmed a terrorist cell just 72 hours ago. Yet now, as she drives through the gentrified streets of her childhood neighborhood, she looks like nothing more than a successful professional returning home from a business trip. Vanessa's dark eyes scan the familiar yet transformed landscape. The abandoned lots where she once played as a child have been replaced by trendy restaurants and boutique shops. The corner store where her mother Dorothy had sent her for milk and bread now houses an artisanal coffee shop with floor-to-ceiling windows and Edison bulb lighting. Progress, she thinks, but at what cost? The displacement of families who had called this place home for generations pushed farther east as property values soared beyond their reach. Her phone buzzes against the dashboard, Dorothy's name illuminating the screen. Vanessa touches the hands-free button, and her mother's warm voice fills the car like a familiar embrace. "Vanessa, baby, are you close? I've been watching the news about these storms." "I'm about 10 minutes away, Mama," Vanessa responds, her voice automatically softening as it always does when speaking to the woman who raised her with nothing but love and determination. "The flight from Prague was delayed, but I'm almost home." "Prague," Dorothy chuckles. "Still can't tell me what you were really doing there, can you?" Vanessa smiles, the first genuine expression she's worn in weeks. Her cover story of attending an international education conference wouldn't fool her mother, but Dorothy had learned long ago not to press for details about her daughter's government work. "Just boring meetings and paperwork, Mama. Nothing exciting." "Mm-hmm," Dorothy hums knowingly. "Well, boring or not, I'm proud of you. Always have been. Drive careful in this weather, you hear?" As the call ends, Vanessa catches sight of something in her rearview mirror that makes her CIA training kick into high alert. A police cruiser, its headlights cutting through the rain about 3 car lengths behind her. Nothing unusual about a patrol car in the city, she tells herself, but something about the way it's maintaining perfect distance sets off alarm bells in her mind. In her line of work, paranoia isn't a character flaw, it's a survival skill. She makes a left turn onto Michigan Avenue, and the cruiser follows. A right onto Trumbull Street, and again it mirrors her movement. Vanessa's pulse remains steady, her breathing controlled, but her mind begins running through protocols. She's done nothing wrong, her license is current, her registration up to date, her diplomatic passport secured in her briefcase. But now, as she drives through the gentrified streets of her childhood neighborhood, she looks like nothing more than a successful professional returning home from a business trip. The rain intensifies, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. Through her side mirror, she can make out the silhouette of the officer behind the wheel, a large man with broad shoulders hunched forward as if studying her every move. When she slows to navigate around a fallen tree branch, he slows. When she speeds up slightly to match the flow of traffic, so does he. Vanessa's training tells her to stay calm, to avoid sudden movements, to give no reason for escalation. But 15 years of covert operations have also taught her to trust her instincts. And right now, every instinct is screaming that this is more than routine patrol. She reaches for her phone, considering calling Marcus Carter, her CIA colleague and one of the few people who knows she's back in the country. But before she can dial, the red and blue lights begin flashing in her mirror, painting the rain-slick street in alternating colors of authority and danger. As she signals and pulls to the curb, Vanessa's mind shifts into the analytical mode that has kept her alive in hostile territories around the world. She notes the time, 10:47 p.m. The location, the 1200 block of Michigan Avenue, well within the affluent Corktown district. the weather conditions that might affect visibility and response times. And, most importantly, she begins the mental documentation that could prove crucial in whatever is about to unfold. The officer's door opens, and through the sheets of rain, she watches as he adjusts his belt and approaches her vehicle with the swagger of a man who believes his badge grants him unlimited authority over anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. Officer Bradley Knox stepped out of his patrol car with the confidence of a hunter who had spotted his prey. The rain immediately soaked through his uniform shirt, but he paid it no mind. His attention was entirely focused on the expensive sedan he'd been following for the past 6 blocks. A black woman, alone, driving through Corktown at nearly 11 p.m. in a car that probably cost more than his annual salary. In Knox's twisted worldview, this was either a drug dealer, a prostitute, or someone who didn't belong in this neighborhood. And tonight, he was determined to find out which. 8 years on the force had taught Knox that the badge on his chest was more than just a symbol. It was a license to exercise power over those he deemed unworthy. The complaints filed against him over the years had been buried in departmental red tape, dismissed by supervisors who valued loyalty over justice. He'd learned that as long as he targeted the right people, minorities, the poor, those without connections, he could operate with virtual impunity. The rain created a curtain of privacy around the traffic stop, washing away potential witnesses and muffling sounds. Perfect conditions for what Knox had in mind. He approached the driver's side window with his hand resting casually on his service weapon, a gesture designed to intimidate rather than protect. When the window rolled down, revealing Dr. Vanessa Washington's composed face, Knox felt a familiar surge of power. "License and registration," he barked without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. No greeting, no explanation for the stop, just a demand delivered with the expectation of submission. Vanessa's hands remained visible on the steering wheel as she responded in a calm, measured tone. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over?" The question hit Knox like a challenge to his authority. In his experience, guilty people asked questions. Innocent people, especially black people who knew their place, simply complied. Her lack of fear, her educated diction, her failure to immediately grovel, all of it grated against his expectations and fueled his growing anger. "You were driving suspiciously," Knox slid smoothly, the fabrication rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "Speeding, weaving between lanes. Now I need to see your license and registration, and I need to know what you're doing in this neighborhood." Vanessa reached slowly for her purse, her movements deliberate and visible. Years of training in hostile territories had taught her that compliance often de-escalated situations, at least temporarily. She handed over her documents while maintaining eye contact, a choice that Knox interpreted as defiance rather than confidence. "Dr. Vanessa Washington," Knox read from her license, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Doctor of what? And this address?" He studied the prestigious Georgetown location listed on her license. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" "I'm visiting family. I grew up in Detroit, on Mack Avenue on the east side." Knox's laugh was harsh and mocking. "East side girl with a Georgetown address and a car worth more than most people's houses? What kind of work do you do, Dr. Washington? And don't tell me you're some kind of surgeon driving around at this hour." The racist implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Knox's assumption was clear. No legitimate profession could account for a black woman's success. In his narrow worldview, her achievements could only be explained by drugs, sex work, or theft. The idea that she might have earned her status through intelligence, dedication, and years of service to her country was beyond his comprehension. "I work for the federal government," Vanessa said carefully, choosing her words to provide truth without revealing classified information. "I'm a policy analyst with the State Department." Knox's expression shifted to one of open disdain. He dealt with what he called uppity suspects before, black professionals who thought their education and employment made them better than others. These are the ones who filed complaints, who knew their rights, who threatened his comfortable world of unchecked authority. They were also the ones he took particular pleasure in humbling. "Policy analyst," he repeated mockingly. "Fancy title for someone driving around in a high-crime area at night. You sure you're not here to buy something you shouldn't be buying? Or maybe sell something?" The accusation was based on nothing but racial prejudice, and they both knew it. Vanessa's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly.
the only sign that Knox's words had found their mark, but she maintained her composure, understanding that any emotional response would be used as justification for escalation. "Officer, I haven't broken any laws," she said firmly. "I was driving home from the airport after a business trip. If there's a specific violation you observed, please write me a ticket. Otherwise, I'd like to continue on my way." Knox's face flushed with anger. The combination of her refusal to be intimidated, her articulate responses, and her subtle challenge to his authority pushed him beyond the point of rational thought. In his mind, she was everything wrong with the changing world. A black woman who didn't know her place, who dared to question his judgment, who carried herself with a confidence that should belong only to people who looked like him.
"Step out of the vehicle," Knox commanded, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "Now." Vanessa's training kicked in, her mind rapidly calculating options and outcomes. She could comply and hope the situation de-escalated, or she could refuse and risk immediate violence. Either choice carried risks, but compliance at least kept her in a position to document whatever happened next. "Officer, is that really necessary? I've provided my identification and—" "I said get out of the car," Knox roared, spittle flying from his lips as his control finally snapped. "Don't make me tell you again." The transformation was complete. The pretense of a legitimate traffic stop had evaporated, revealing the truth beneath. A racist predator who had cornered his prey and was ready to strike. As Vanessa slowly opened her car door, the rain seemed to intensify, as if the heavens themselves were weeping for the injustice about to unfold. What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. A moment when the thin veneer of civilization cracked to reveal the brutal reality that had been festering beneath. Knox grabbed Vanessa's arm as she stepped from the vehicle, his grip tight enough to leave bruises, his face twisted with a rage that had been building since the moment she'd refused to cower before his authority. "You think you're better than me?" Knox snarled, his voice barely human now, reduced to the primal growl of a predator asserting dominance. "You think your fancy degrees and your government job make you special? Let me teach you something about respect." Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The first blow came without warning, an open-handed slap across Vanessa's face that echoed through the rain-soaked street like a gunshot. The force of it snapped her head to the side, and she tasted blood where her teeth cut into her cheek. But even as pain flared across her face, her CIA training kicked in, her mind automatically documenting every detail of the assault for the federal case that would inevitably follow. Knox's second strike was a closed fist to her abdomen, doubling her over as the air rushed from her lungs. The impact sent shockwaves of agony through her body, but Vanessa forced herself to remain conscious, to stay alert, to remember. This wasn't just happening to her. It was happening to every black citizen who had ever been brutalized by those sworn to protect them. This was the moment when justice would finally have its day. "That's what happens when you don't show proper respect to law enforcement," Knox panted, standing over her as she struggled to catch her breath. "Maybe next time you'll remember your place." The rain mixed with blood on Vanessa's face as she slowly straightened, her dark eyes meeting Knox's with a calmness that seemed to unnerve him. There was no fear in her gaze, no submission, no acknowledgement of his assumed superiority. Instead, there was something else, a quiet strength that came from years of facing down terrorists and dictators, a professional composure born from knowing that real power had nothing to do with badges or uniforms. Knox raised his hand again, but something in Vanessa's expression stopped him. It was subtle, just a slight shift in her posture, a barely perceptible change in the way she held herself, but suddenly the dynamic felt different. The prey was transforming into something else entirely. "Dr. Vanessa Washington?" she said quietly, her voice steady despite the blood trickling from her split lip. "Before you continue with your assault, there's something you should know." She reached slowly into her jacket pocket, her movements deliberate and visible to avoid giving Knox any excuse for further violence. When her hand emerged, it held a black leather wallet, expensive and official-looking. Knox watched warily as she flipped it open, revealing something that made his blood turn to ice in his veins. The Central Intelligence Agency credentials gleamed in the streetlight, the federal seal catching the rain and reflecting it back like a mirror. The identification photo showed the same composed face that was now looking at him with the quiet authority of someone whose power extended far beyond the boundaries of any city, state, or local jurisdiction. Dr. Vanessa Washington wasn't just a policy analyst. She was a decorated intelligence officer whose security clearance was higher than anyone he'd ever encountered in his miserable career. Knox's face went white as the full implications hit him like a physical blow. He had just assaulted a federal agent. Not just any federal agent, but a CIA operative whose security clearance was higher than anyone he'd ever encountered in his miserable career. The complaints he'd dodged, the misconduct he'd covered up, the victims he'd silenced, none of that mattered now. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Attacked someone with the power to destroy not just his career, but his entire life. You're, he stammered, his arrogance crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. The swagger was gone, replaced by the desperate panic of a man who had just sealed his own fate.
Dr. Vanessa Washington, she said calmly, tucking the credentials back into her jacket. 15-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, specializing in counterterrorism and international relations. And as of this moment, Officer Knox, you are under federal investigation for assault on a federal agent, civil rights violations, and deprivation of rights under color of law. Knox's legs seemed to give out beneath him. The weight of what he'd done, what he'd always done, but never to someone with this level of authority, crashed down on him like a collapsing building. All those years of believing his badge made him untouchable, all those victims who couldn't fight back, all that arrogance and hatred had led him to this moment when real power had quietly, calmly, and completely destroyed him. The rain continued to fall, washing the blood from Vanessa's face, but not the evidence of what had transpired. In her mind, she was already composing the report that would trigger a federal investigation into not just Knox, but the entire culture of corruption that had enabled him. This wasn't just about one racist cop. This was about a system that had failed countless victims before her. And as Knox stood there in the rain, watching his career and freedom evaporate before his eyes, he finally understood the difference between real authority and the cheap intimidation he'd mistaken for power. Dr. Vanessa Washington didn't need to raise her voice or threaten violence to command respect. She simply was what he had always pretended to be, someone with the genuine authority to ensure that justice would finally be served. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the rain like thunder rolling across the Detroit skyline. Knox stood frozen beside his patrol car, his radio crackling with urgent chatter as news of the incident spread through law enforcement channels faster than wildfire. Every passing second brought him closer to a reckoning he'd never imagined possible, and every raindrop seemed to wash away another piece of the immunity he'd taken for granted. The first to arrive was a black SUV with government plates, its headlights cutting through the storm like searchlights hunting for truth. From the passenger seat emerged Marcus Carter, a man whose presence commanded immediate attention even in civilian clothes. His 6'3" frame moved with the controlled grace of someone accustomed to danger, while beside him, 12-year-old Jamal maneuvered his wheelchair with quiet determination, his young eyes already understanding that history was unfolding before him. "Vanessa," Marcus called out, his voice carrying both relief and barely contained fury as he approached his colleague. The sight of blood on her face and the visible bruises forming on her arms triggered something primal in the seasoned operative, the protective instinct that had kept them both alive through countless missions abroad. Knox watched in growing panic as Marcus knelt beside Vanessa, his trained eyes quickly assessing her injuries while his mind calculated the federal storm about to descend. This wasn't just any CIA agent. Marcus Carter was a legend in intelligence circles, a man whose operations had prevented terrorist attacks and toppled corrupt regimes. And right now, his attention was focused entirely on the cop who had dared to assault his partner. The arrival of Captain Sarah Mitchell in her department-issued sedan only intensified the tension crackling through the air. 20 years of service had taught her to read situations quickly, and what she saw made her stomach drop. Knox standing like a deer in headlights, a bloodied black woman with federal credentials, and Marcus Carter's unmistakable profile all pointed to a catastrophe that could destroy careers and end her pension dreams. "Officer Knox," Mitchell barked, her voice cutting through the rain, "what the hell happened here?" Knox's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. How could he explain that he'd assaulted a CIA operative based on nothing more than racist assumptions? How could he justify the unjustifiable to a captain who was already calculating how to minimize the department's liability? Detective Maria Santos arrived moments later, her patrol car sliding to a stop as she took in the scene. Unlike Mitchell, Maria's expression wasn't one of damage control. It was recognition. She'd been filing reports about Knox's misconduct for years, watching them disappear into administrative black holes while he continued his reign of terror on the streets she'd sworn to protect. Vanessa, still composed despite her injuries, reached into her jacket and retrieved a secure satellite phone. Her fingers moved across the keypad with practiced precision as she placed a call that would change everything. "This is Agent Washington, badge number 4472. I need an immediate federal response team to my location. Officer-involved assault on a federal agent, priority 1. Knox's legs finally gave out completely, and he collapsed against his patrol car as the full weight of federal authority descended upon him. Captain Mitchell's face went pale as she realized her department was about to be placed under federal microscope, while Maria Santos felt a surge of hope that justice might finally be possible. Marcus placed a protective hand on Jamal's shoulder as sirens began wailing in the distance, not local police, but federal agents responding to an attack on one of their own. The boy looked up at Vanessa with admiration, seeing in her the same strength his father had taught him to recognize and respect.
The federal response arrived like a hurricane making landfall, transforming the quiet Corktown street into a crime scene that would reshape Detroit's law enforcement forever. FBI vehicles surrounded the area, while CIA operatives in dark suits moved with the efficiency of a military operation, each agent understanding that an attack on one of them was an attack on all. Agent Rebecca Torres, FBI's Civil Rights Division chief, took control of the scene with the authority of someone who'd built her career prosecuting corrupt cops. Her first action was securing Knox in federal custody, reading him rights that carried penalties far beyond anything the local system could impose. As handcuffs clicked around Knox's wrists, the sound echoed like a death knell for the culture of impunity he'd represented. Detective Maria Santos approached Torres with a metal filing cabinet she'd retrieved from her personal vehicle. "Agent Torres, I've been documenting Officer Knox's misconduct for 3 years. Every complaint, every incident, every time the department buried evidence." Her hands shook slightly as she opened the files, revealing a pattern of abuse that stretched back to Knox's first days on the force. The evidence was damning. Dozens of civilian complaints dismissed without investigation, use of force reports that had been altered, witness statements that had disappeared from official files. Each document painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached into the highest levels of the department hierarchy, with Captain Mitchell's signature appearing on dismissal after dismissal of legitimate complaints. Mitchell stood nearby, watching her career crumble as federal agents photographed every page of Maria's carefully preserved documentation. 20 years of looking the other way, of choosing loyalty to corrupt officers over justice for victims, had led to this moment of reckoning. Her pension, her reputation, her legacy, all of it was evaporating in the rain like smoke from a dying fire. Vanessa, despite her injuries, worked alongside the federal team with the precision of a surgeon dissecting a tumor. Her analytical mind, honed by years of intelligence work, identified connections and patterns that local investigators had missed or deliberately ignored. Each piece of evidence revealed another layer of the conspiracy that had protected Knox and officers like him. The investigation expanded rapidly as community members, emboldened by the federal presence, began coming forward with their own stories of police brutality. A grandmother who'd been thrown to the ground during a bogus traffic stop. A teenager whose ribs had been broken during an arrest for suspicious behavior. Families who'd filed complaints only to watch them disappear into the bureaucratic void. Marcus coordinated with federal prosecutors while Jamal documented everything with the keen eye of someone who'd learned to recognize injustice at an early age. The boy's presence served as a powerful reminder of who benefited when corruption was exposed and justice was served. His wheelchair became a symbol of vulnerability that deserved protection, not exploitation. As dawn approached, Knox sat in federal custody facing charges that would ensure he never wore a badge again. Civil rights violations, assault on a federal agent, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, each count carrying years in federal prison. The man who'd believed his uniform made him untouchable now faced the full weight of justice he'd spent his career avoiding. Captain Mitchell was escorted to her office under federal supervision, her files and computer seized as evidence in what had become the largest police corruption investigation in Detroit's history. The web of misconduct she'd helped weave was finally unraveling, thread by damning thread. By morning, news of the federal investigation had spread through Detroit's neighborhoods like wildfire through dry timber, igniting hope in communities that long ago stopped believing justice was possible. The story of Dr. Vanessa Washington, a daughter of Detroit's East Side who'd returned home to face down the very system that had oppressed her people, resonated with a power that transcended the details of any single incident. Dorothy Washington stood in the community sector where she'd taught Sunday school for 30 years, surrounded by families whose lives had been touched by police violence. The room buzzed with an energy she hadn't felt since the civil rights marches of her youth, when ordinary people discovered they had the power to change the world through courage and collective action. "My daughter didn't plan to become a symbol," Dorothy said, her voice carrying across the packed room. "She was just coming home from work, doing what she's always done, serving her country with honor. But sometimes God puts us exactly where we need to be when we need to be there." The crowd murmured agreement as survivor after survivor took the microphone to share stories that had been buried for years. Mrs. Johnson, whose grandson had been beaten during a traffic stop that never appeared in official reports. Mr. Rodriguez, whose small business had been repeatedly harassed by officers demanding protection payments. Each testimony added another piece to the mosaic of corruption that federal investigators were painstakingly assembling. Jamal wheeled his chair to the front of the room, his young voice carrying a weight beyond his years. He said, "My dad always taught me that real strength isn't about having power over other people. It's about using whatever power you have to protect those who can't protect themselves. Dr. Washington showed us what that looks like."
The media attention intensified as national news networks picked up the story of the CIA agent who turned a racist assault into a federal case that was dismantling an entire culture of police corruption. Reporters from major newspapers arrived to document how one woman's courage had sparked a movement that was spreading beyond Detroit's borders. Mayor Patricia Williams, faced with mounting pressure and federal oversight, announced comprehensive police reforms within 48 hours of Knox's arrest. Body cameras for all officers, civilian oversight boards with real authority, federal monitors in every precinct. Changes that community activists had demanded for decades were suddenly becoming reality. The ripple effects extended far beyond policy changes. Young people who'd grown up believing the system was stacked against them began to see possibilities they'd never imagined. Law school applications from Detroit residents spiked as kids who'd never considered careers in justice realized they could be the change they wanted to see. Dorothy organized support groups for families affected by police violence, creating safe spaces where trauma could be acknowledged and healing could begin. The community center became a hub of activity as people who'd been isolated by their experiences discovered they weren't alone in their struggle for dignity and justice. Knox's previous victims found their voices as federal prosecutors reached out to build cases that would ensure accountability for years of abuse. Each testimony strengthened the growing movement while providing closure for families who'd never expected to see justice served. As Vanessa recovered from her physical injuries, she watched her community transform with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd seen her personal trauma become a catalyst for systemic change. The pain Knox had inflicted was real, but it had also revealed the path forward, through courage, truth, and the unwavering belief that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. Picture this. The federal courthouse in downtown Detroit buzzing with an energy that hadn't been felt since the civil rights trials of the 1960s. Every seat in Judge Patricia Hendrick's courtroom filled with community members, activists, and reporters who understood they were witnessing more than just a trial. They were seeing the moment when decades of police impunity would finally face the scales of justice. And at the center of it all sat Officer Bradley Knox, no longer swaggering with false authority, but hunched over the defense table like a man whose world had collapsed around him. Judge Hendricks, a woman whose reputation for fairness had been forged through years as a federal prosecutor, called the courtroom to order with the gravity befitting a case that would set precedents for police accountability across the nation. Her dark eyes surveyed the packed gallery before settling on the prosecution table, where federal attorneys had assembled evidence so damning that Knox's defense team had already approached them about plea bargains. When Dr. Vanessa Washington took the witness stand, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Dressed in a navy blue suit that commanded respect without ostentation, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had faced down international terrorists yet found herself bloodied on a Detroit street by a racist cop. Her testimony was precise, methodical, devastating, each word carefully chosen to paint a picture of systematic abuse that had finally met its match. Officer Knox struck me because he believed his badge gave him the right to brutalize anyone he deemed unworthy. He assumed that a black woman driving through an affluent neighborhood must be engaged in criminal activity. He was wrong on every count, but most importantly, he was wrong to believe that his uniform placed him above the law. Knox's defense attorney, a public defender overwhelmed by the mountain of evidence against his client, attempted to portray the assault as a momentary lapse in judgment by an otherwise dedicated officer. But Detective Maria Santos's testimony shattered that narrative completely. File after file of suppressed complaints,
altered reports and covered up incidents painted Knox not as a cop who'd made a mistake, but as a predator who'd spent years terrorizing the very community he'd sworn to protect. The parade of Knox's previous victims transformed the trial into a reckoning with institutional racism itself. Mrs. Coleman, whose son had been beaten unconscious during a traffic stop that never appeared in official records. Mr. Singh, whose convenience store had been repeatedly targeted for inspections that always ended with demands for cash payments. Each testimony added another stone to the mountain of evidence that Knox represented not an aberration, but a symptom of a diseased system. Knox himself never took the stand, his attorney knowing that any cross-examination would only reveal the depth of his client's hatred and arrogance. Instead, he sat silently as his victims reclaimed their voices and his crimes were laid bare before a jury that included members of the very communities he'd terrorized for so long. The jury's verdict came after less than 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all federal charges. As Judge Hendricks read each count aloud, Knox's shoulders sagged further, the weight of justice finally crushing the arrogance that had sustained him through years of unchecked brutality. Civil rights violations, assault on a federal agent, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, each guilty verdict echoed through the courtroom like thunder announcing a new era.
When Hendricks sentenced Knox to 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, the community members in the gallery didn't cheer or celebrate. Instead, there was a profound silence that spoke to the gravity of the moment. Justice had been served, but at a cost measured in decades of suffering that could never be fully repaid. Knox was led away in shackles, his federal prison uniform a stark contrast to the police blues he'd worn with such misplaced pride. As the courtroom doors closed behind him, they symbolically sealed an era when racist cops could abuse their authority without consequences. The man who'd believed his badge made him untouchable would spend the next decade and a half learning that real justice reaches everyone eventually. But Knox's conviction was only the beginning of the systemic changes his assault on Dr. Washington had triggered. Captain Sarah Mitchell submitted her resignation the day after the verdict, her 20-year career ending in disgrace as federal investigators seized her records and revealed the full extent of her complicity in covering up misconduct. Her pension, her reputation, her legacy, all sacrificed on the altar of willful blindness to corruption. Detective Maria Santos was promoted to captain, becoming the youngest person and first Latina woman to hold that rank in the department's history. Her first act was implementing the federal consent decree that placed the entire force under judicial oversight, ensuring that the reforms born from Vanessa's courage would be permanent rather than temporary. The changes extended far beyond personnel shuffles. Every officer was required to wear body cameras that couldn't be turned off during interactions with civilians. A civilian oversight board with subpoena power was established, chaired by Dorothy Washington and staffed with community members who understood the neighborhoods they were meant to protect. Federal monitors embedded in every precinct, ensuring that the culture of accountability would take root and flourish. The legal precedents established by Knox's conviction sent shockwaves through police departments nationwide. Federal prosecutors in Chicago, Baltimore, and Phoenix began reviewing cases that had previously been dismissed by local authorities. The message was clear: assault a citizen, especially a federal agent, and face the full weight of federal justice, regardless of the badge you wear. Knox's fellow officers, many of whom had operated under similar assumptions of immunity, found themselves facing a new reality where misconduct carried real consequences. Complaint filings increased dramatically as community members who'd lost faith in the system began to believe that justice might actually be possible. Vanessa watched these changes unfold from her CIA office, where she'd returned to the classified work that had always been her calling. But her experience had changed her. She now served not just as an intelligence officer protecting America's interests abroad, but as a symbol that courage in the face of injustice could transform entire systems of oppression. 6 months after Knox's sentencing, Detroit's transformation had become a model for police reform that cities across America were studying and implementing. The federal oversight that had seemed like an intrusion to some officers had evolved into a partnership that attracted the kind of recruits who actually wanted to serve and protect rather than intimidate and control. Dr. Vanessa Washington stood before a packed auditorium at Wayne State University, accepting the university's Distinguished Alumni Award for public service. The bruises from Knox's assault had long since healed, but the impact of her courage continued to ripple through Detroit and beyond. Students who'd grown up believing the system was stacked against them now saw her as proof that individual integrity could spark institutional change. "Justice isn't a destination you reach," Vanessa told the crowd, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd faced down corruption at home and terrorists abroad. "It's a direction you choose every day in every decision you make." When Officer Knox struck me, he thought he was teaching me about power. Instead, he learned that real power lies not in the ability to hurt others, but in the courage to heal what's broken. Dorothy Washington sat in the front row, her face glowing with pride as she watched her daughter speak truth to a new generation of leaders. The community center where she'd organized those first meetings had become a hub for police-community collaboration, hosting monthly forums where officers and residents worked together to address problems before they escalated into conflicts. Jamal Carter, now 13 and more eloquent than many adults, had become a regular speaker at youth conferences about justice and resilience. His wheelchair no longer seemed like a symbol of vulnerability. It had transformed into a platform from which he inspired other young people to believe they could change the world despite any obstacles they faced. The new police recruits completing training at the Reformed Academy bore little resemblance to the officers of Knox's era. They came from diverse backgrounds, many of them community college graduates who'd grown up in the neighborhoods they now patrolled. Their training emphasized de-escalation, cultural competency, and constitutional law rather than aggressive tactics and survival training. Detective Santos, now Captain Santos, walked the same streets where Knox had once terrorized residents, but her presence was welcomed rather than feared. Crime rates had actually decreased as community trust in law enforcement grew, proving that accountability and effectiveness weren't opposing forces but complementary aspects of legitimate policing.
Knox himself served his sentence in a federal facility in Michigan, his days spent in solitary contemplation of the choices that had led him from sworn protector to convicted felon. His case was studied in criminal justice programs as an example of how racism and unchecked authority could corrupt even those entrusted with public safety. Vanessa balanced her CIA responsibilities with advocacy work, testifying before Congress about police reform and consulting with other cities implementing oversight programs. Her experience had taught her that protecting America's values abroad required ensuring those same values were upheld at home. The healing process wasn't complete. Decades of mistrust couldn't be erased in months of reform. But progress was measurable. Community police relations improved month by month. Young people began viewing law enforcement as a legitimate career path, and families like the Washingtons could drive through any neighborhood without fearing harassment based on their skin color. As evening fell over Detroit, Vanessa drove through the same Corktown streets where Knox had attacked her, now patrolled by officers who understood that their authority came from the community's consent rather than fear. The rain had stopped, the storm had passed, and justice had finally come home. Picture this. 1 year later, the same rain-soaked streets of Detroit's Corktown district, but transformed by something more powerful than gentrification or urban renewal, the quiet revolution that happens when justice finally finds its voice. The streetlights cast the same amber glow, but the shadows no longer hide the fear that once stalked these neighborhoods like a predator hunting prey. Instead, they frame a new reality where police cruisers patrol with the consent of the governed rather than the intimidation of the oppressed. Dr. Vanessa Washington walked those familiar streets, her footsteps echoing with the confidence of someone who had turned personal trauma into systemic change. The federal oversight model, born from her assault, had spread to 17 cities across America, each implementation carrying her story like a torch passed from one community to another.
Police departments from Seattle to Miami were studying the Detroit reforms, learning that accountability and effectiveness weren't opposing forces, but complementary aspects of legitimate law enforcement. In her briefcase, Vanessa carried the Presidential Medal of Freedom she'd received that morning. Recognition not just for her years of CIA service abroad, but for her courage in facing down corruption at home. The ceremony had been attended by Marcus Carter and his son Jamal, now 14 and serving as youth ambassador for the National Police Reform Council. The boy's presence reminded everyone that change wasn't just about fixing past wrongs, but about building a future where children could grow up trusting the very officers sworn to protect them. Knox remained in federal prison, his cell a stark reminder that badges don't grant immunity from consequences. His case had become required reading in every police academy in the country, a cautionary tale about how racism and unchecked authority could transform protectors into predators. Former colleagues who'd once shared his attitudes now walked their beats with body cameras and civilian oversight, their behavior monitored by the very communities they'd once terrorized. The new generation of Detroit officers bore no resemblance to Knox's era of impunity. Captain Maria Santos had recruited from community colleges and social work programs, building a force that reflected the diversity of the city it served. Crime rates had dropped as community trust increased, proving that safety came not from fear, but from partnership between police and residents. Dorothy Washington stood in her community center, now named the Vanessa Washington Center for Justice and Healing, watching young people participate in civilian oversight training. These teenagers would grow up understanding that democracy required vigilance, that justice demanded participation, and that courage could change the world when wielded by ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. As evening fell over Detroit, Vanessa drove past the exact spot where Knox had struck her, now marked by a small memorial plaque reading, "Where Justice Began." The location had become a pilgrimage site for activists and reformers, a reminder that individual courage could spark movements that reshape entire systems of power. The story that began with racist violence had evolved into something larger, a testament to the truth that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. Knox's assault had been intended to silence and intimidate, but instead it had amplified voices that had been ignored for too long and empowered communities that had been marginalized for decades. The rain continued to fall on Detroit's streets, but now it washed away the last remnants of an era when badges meant brutality instead of service. Dr. Vanessa Washington's legacy wasn't just the reforms she'd triggered or the precedents she'd established. It was the understanding that real authority comes not from the power to harm others, but from the courage to heal what's broken and the commitment to ensure that justice, once achieved, would never again be forgotten. Picture this. 5 years after that rain-soaked night in Detroit when justice first found its voice, the ripple effects of Dr. Vanessa Washington's courage had spread across America like waves from a stone dropped into still water. The story that began with one woman's refusal to be broken by brutality had evolved into a movement that transformed not just policing, but the very understanding of what it meant to serve and protect in a democratic society.
The annual Justice and Accountability Summit convened in Detroit's newly constructed Community Safety Center, a gleaming building that stood where the old precinct headquarters once housed decades of covered-up misconduct. Representatives from 43 cities had gathered to share progress reports, challenges, and innovations in the ongoing effort to build police departments worthy of the communities they served. And at the center of it all stood Dr. Vanessa Washington, no longer just a CIA operative who'd been assaulted by a racist cop, but a symbol of how individual courage could spark institutional transformation. The keynote address drew standing room-only crowds, with attendees ranging from police chiefs to community activists, federal prosecutors to formerly incarcerated individuals who'd found their voices in the aftermath of reform. Vanessa approached the podium with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through interrogations of international terrorists and confrontations with corrupt officials in hostile territories. But this audience was different. These were the people building the future of American law enforcement, one reform department at a time. 5 years ago, Officer Bradley Knox believed his badge gave him the right to brutalize anyone he deemed unworthy, Vanessa began, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium. He was wrong about many things that night, but his greatest error was believing that power comes from the ability to harm others rather than the courage to heal what's broken. In the audience, Captain Maria Santos nodded from her seat in the front row. She'd been promoted to deputy chief the previous year, becoming the highest-ranking Latina in Detroit Police Department history. Under her leadership, the department had achieved something once thought impossible. They'd actually gained the trust of the communities they policed. Crime rates had dropped by 30%, while complaint filings had increased dramatically, proving that accountability and effectiveness weren't opposing forces, but complementary aspects of legitimate policing. Marcus Carter sat beside his son Jamal, now 19 and a sophomore at Howard University studying criminal justice with a focus on constitutional law. The young man who'd witnessed his father's strength in standing up to corruption had chosen to dedicate his life to ensuring that future generations wouldn't face the same injustices. His wheelchair had become a platform from which he spoke truth to power, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood both vulnerability and resilience. Dorothy Washington occupied a place of honor on the dais, her silver hair reflecting the stage lights as she listened to her daughter speak about the changes they'd all helped create. At 73, she'd become a national figure in police reform, testifying before Congress about community oversight and consulting with cities implementing civilian review boards. The community center that bore her daughter's name had spawned similar facilities in 26 cities, each serving as a bridge between law enforcement and the people they'd sworn to protect. The statistics Vanessa shared painted a picture of transformation that exceeded even the most optimistic projections from those early days of federal intervention. Police-involved shootings had dropped by 60% in cities implementing the Detroit model. Excessive force complaints had fallen by 75%, while officer recruitment from diverse communities had tripled. Perhaps most importantly, public trust in law enforcement, measured through annual surveys conducted by independent research organizations, had reached levels not seen since the 1960s. But the changes went deeper than numbers could capture. Vanessa clicked to the next slide, showing photographs of police academies where recruits now spent as much time studying constitutional law and de-escalation techniques as they did learning tactical operations. The new generation of officers looked nothing like Knox's era. They were diverse, educated, and committed to the idea that their authority came from community consent rather than fear. The transformation we've achieved isn't just about changing policies or procedures. It's about fundamentally altering the relationship between those who enforce the law and those who live under it. We've proven that safety doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from partnership, respect, and the understanding that every person deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their race, economic status, or neighborhood. Judge Patricia Hendricks, now serving on the Federal Court of Appeals after her exemplary handling of Knox's trial, watched from the gallery as Vanessa outlined the legal precedents that had emerged from that pivotal case. The Knox decision, as it had become known in legal circles, had established federal jurisdiction over local police misconduct in ways that transformed civil rights enforcement. Prosecutors across the country now had tools to pursue justice in cases that would have been dismissed or ignored by local authorities just 5 years earlier. Knox himself remained in federal prison, his case studied in criminal justice programs as a cautionary tale about how racism and unchecked authority could corrupt even those entrusted with public safety. He'd become eligible for parole after serving 10 years, but early reports from prison officials suggested he remained unrepentant, clinging to the same attitudes that had led to his downfall. His continued incarceration served as a reminder that consequences for misconduct were real,
and lasting. Former Captain Sarah Mitchell had left Detroit entirely, her pension revoked and her law enforcement certification permanently suspended. She'd found work as a security guard at a shopping mall in suburban Phoenix, a dramatic fall from grace that served as a warning to other supervisors who might be tempted to cover up misconduct rather than address it. Her case had become a cautionary tale about the personal cost of choosing loyalty to corrupt officers over accountability to the public. Vanessa's presentation shifted to highlight the unintended consequences of reform, benefits that had emerged organically as communities and police departments learned to work together rather than against each other. Crime clearance rates had improved as witnesses became more willing to cooperate with investigations. Officer retention had increased as recruits attracted to the profession for noble reasons found departments that supported rather than corrupted their ideals. Property values had risen in previously neglected neighborhoods as residents gained confidence that their rights would be protected rather than violated by those sworn to serve them. The international implications had been equally profound. Vanessa's dual role as CIA operative and police reform advocate had given her unique credibility when discussing human rights issues with foreign governments. How could America criticize authoritarian regimes for police brutality while tolerating similar abuses at home? The reforms sparked by her assault had strengthened America's moral authority in international forums, proving that democracy could evolve and self-correct when confronted with evidence of injustice. The summit's afternoon sessions featured breakout groups where police chiefs and community leaders worked together to address ongoing challenges. Not every city had embraced reform willingly. Some had required federal intervention through consent decrees, similar to Detroit's. Others had adopted changes voluntarily after witnessing the benefits of improved police-community relations. The resistance remained real in certain jurisdictions, but it was increasingly isolated as success stories multiplied and best practices spread. Jamal Carter addressed the Youth Caucus, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd grown up witnessing both the worst and best of American law enforcement. "My generation won't accept the idea that police brutality is just the way things are," he told an audience of teenagers from across the country. "We've seen what's possible when courage meets institutional change. We know that reform isn't just about fixing past wrongs. It's about building a future where every child can grow up trusting the people sworn to protect them." The evening's award ceremony recognized individuals whose courage had sparked change in their own communities. A grandmother in Baltimore whose video documentation of police misconduct had led to federal intervention. A police officer in Phoenix who testified against colleagues despite personal and professional risks. A teenage activist in Oakland whose organizing had forced city officials to implement civilian oversight boards with real authority. Vanessa watched as each recipient accepted their recognition, understanding that her story was just one thread in a larger tapestry of courage and change. The assault knocks had intended to silence her voice had instead amplified voices that had been ignored for too long. The incident that was supposed to teach her about power had instead demonstrated that real power, the kind that changes systems and transforms societies, belongs to those with the courage to stand up for what's right, regardless of the badge their oppressor might wear. The rain continued to fall on Detroit's streets, but now it washed away the last remnants of an era when fear masqueraded as law and order. In its place had grown something stronger, more just, and more worthy of the democratic ideals America claimed to represent. And at the center of it all was the quiet understanding that one person's courage, wielded with integrity and purpose, could indeed change the world. The story that began with a racist assault had become a testament to the truth that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied, and that sometimes the most powerful response to violence is the steady, unwavering commitment to building something better from the broken pieces of what came before. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.